Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia was, and I say this wholeheartedly, one of the greatest Final Fantasy games to ever exist. And you'll never ever get a chance to play or experience this surreal crossover game that lasted 67 years. Between nearly 200 characters ranging from Final Fantasy 1 through 15, Tactics, Type 0, Crystal Chronicles, World of Final Fantasy, Crisis Core and more, the sheer amount of playable units, each with their very own distinct playstyles, animations, voice lines, niches, gimmicks, and mechanics in battle, the breadth of this game was comparable to none. And it wasn't just the fact that it had an abundance of characters, it was the idea that in this game, and only this game, you could see real-time interactions between your favorite cast members of various Final Fantasy games. Go on side quests together, fight bosses from different Final Fantasy games together, experience life after death for some of those characters as they were pulled from the finales of their respective titles, and enjoy for what is, and was, for most, a fanfiction crossover of our wildest dreams and imagination. DFFOO will go down in Final Fantasy history as one of my favorite Final Fantasy games, with one of the best and most in-depth turn-based combat systems in the entire series, and any RPG for that matter, and I will miss it terribly, surely pining over its loss in the years to come. So for one final time, Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, End of Service, a now extinct masterpiece that has been withdrawn from our lives, lost to the ages, a bygone relic discarded to being a memory forever in our hearts. Let's talk about it. Ladies and or gentlemen, welcome back or welcome to the channel. My name is Zeno and this is my living legacy. Remember, if you like what I do here, talking about the games that I love, remember to like the video so YouTube knows it doesn't suck, and leave a comment down below letting me know what you think of today's content. Today's legacy is 100% one for the books. We're going to be covering my history with Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, which we will call DFFOO for short, in a mix of a brief retrospective tied with a culmination of my own personal opinions, and why I love this game so much over the 3-4 years that I was part of the community and in the space, as well as going over what I think of the game as a whole, as a live service gacha game, as a community member, and at one stage a small part of the content creator scene myself with my own dedicated DFFOO channel, what the game did right, what it did wrong, and most importantly, just relish in the fact that I was able to live through this piece of legacy in Final Fantasy history. A lot of this video, I've tried to be as non-biased as possible and take a deeper look at things from a broader view and perspective, but of course I am just one man's opinion, recapping one man's experience playing through this game, so each person's opinions may very heavily differ from mine. For those that don't know a lot about DFFOO, the TLDR is, it's a live service gacha game. You summon for weapons, all the characters were free. They were based on nearly the entire Final Fantasy franchise, with a cast of characters nearing the 200 mark by its closure. It had an incredibly deep turn-based battle system, which in my humble opinion eclipses any of the mainline console games in its history, pure turn-based wise anyway. It had side stories, events, endgame content, time-limited content, exclusive content releases that differed from the JP region counterpart. It was, by all metrics, a fairly stock standard, typical live service gacha game. So I think what it boils down to the most, and what I want to touch on first and foremost, is the crux of what I think made DFFOO so remarkably special, for it to endure and survive so long compared to most other old school looking turn-based gacha games in the space. It was the persistent and tenacious community which nearly prevailed above everything else that it offered. Now, I've been a part of the live service communities for over 10 years now. I've been playing gacha games and the like for a very long time. I once had a YouTube channel called TXB Gaming, which at its peak had just over 12,000 subscribers from a gacha game called Bleach Brave Souls that I had amassed in less than 2 years. I've covered various gacha games extensively and briefly alike on 2 different YouTube channels now prior to this one in the past for over 7 years off and on. It wasn't until I joined the community for DFFOO that I realized just how extensive that community reach was, despite how the game catered to a very specific niche audience with a small-scale player base to back it up. From monthly official live streams where the community managers generally cherished and interacted with the people, personally remembering content creators and viewers' names, were in their Discords, Reddit, Twitter during their own personal time off work, and even played video games with some of them. From the community-made TCC podcast and various live shows that discussed the game on a weekly to monthly basis, combing over in fine detail, breaking down all of the game's content, character kits, upcoming releases, while doling out helpful information to hardcore veterans and new players alike, to the ridiculous amount of generalistic YouTubers and streamers that made every possible video imaginable, from before you summon, breakdowns, deep dive analysis, endgame content tutorials, runs of the latest events using many different types of teams, including multiple challenge runs that were also adopted by the community to bring more life into the game during downtime, to the websites that were made and run by super dedicated fans, sometimes teams of them for free, that had comprehensive glossaries of information from both the global and JP servers of the game, the encyclopedic library of every monster, weapon, armor, event, character, stage, item, statistic, passive ability, and more. Everything you can think of, it was there. DFFOO had it all, and honestly, when you look at it from a bird's eye view, it didn't even make much sense for such a small game to have such a vast amount of community-driven content, but it was a refreshing experience to be part of something that was so minute but feeling so substantial at the same time. This game's extremely loyal community not only carried the game on its back, but it propped it up. It held the line. During the times when the game was in bad spots due to unbalanced weapons and characters, not enough events or reasons to return logging in every day or week, to difficulty spikes or just general bugs and glitches, to lackluster content drops, it was the community that held everything afloat. I've never seen in my life a game's community that was so boundless, so considerable of the game and its treatment towards its players across the board. The community was a spectacular timepiece that should be absolutely applauded and congratulated on how to welcome in, lift up, and treat its fellow Final Fantasy enthusiasts. DFFOO wasn't just community though. In fact, there was many other important factors as to why I think the game lasted so long, which included the aforementioned ocean-wide cast of selectable and playable units from many FF games, the incredible in-depth turn-based battle system that by the game's end had an absolute multitude amount of mechanics to keep track of that could easily turn people off, which it did for me, and we'll touch on that later, but it's also its gacha system. Yeah, the gacha was actually one of the good parts of the game, believe it or not, so hear me out. Now, not everyone will agree and share this opinion at all, and that's totally fair, like most of this video, but hindsight's 2020 though, right? If this game didn't have a good gacha to coincide with all the positive community aspects, it wouldn't have lasted this long, especially on such a smaller scale player base. Any other game would have been shut down years prior. Speaking of, let's just go over the gacha while we're covering it at this point. I mentioned earlier, every character in the game was actually free to obtain. You could feasibly collect any and all of your favorite released Final Fantasy cast members through events and story chapters. None of that was gated behind currency or money. Yes, there was definitely people that were absent from the roster. Red 13 from Final Fantasy VII, Riku from Final Fantasy X and X-2. Final Fantasy Tactics only had 2 units, Ramza and Agrias. Final Fantasy XIV was stuck in the past of the base game and the first expansion's Heaven's Ward, never releasing anything more popular. Heck, there were units that were stuck in the game's files for like over 5 years, so we knew at one point a selective few units that were on the table to be created but never ended up being so. So even if you had bad luck with the RNG gacha systems not being able to obtain all the weapons or the most up-to-date ones that would come with specific character tuning passes, you could still put them in your teams and play with them. In fact, there was many people across a community that did exactly that. Just played it as a character collector game, and that was a totally valid and fun way to play. What you did summon for though was weapons using gems and tickets you obtained through dailies, events, limited time content, the usual gacha stuff. The thing about the currency in DFFOO was though, the devs were hilariously generous with what they doled out. On average, a player that completed all the content in a month, or even say 80 to 90% of said content, could guarantee banner weapons at its hard pity, let alone the hundreds of tickets you could use instead in their place. While tickets didn't guarantee you anything, there were sometimes months where people weren't only using tickets to get banner weapons for extensively free, I'm using air quotes here, myself being one of them. Due to the fact that DFFOO had such a mammoth cast of characters, there were times that there just wasn't anybody that you wanted to summon for, so resources stacked up incredibly fast if you played long term, that for a subsection of the player base, and I was one of them again, we had 6 to 10 plus months of free to play currency backed up in savings to guarantee any weapon of any rarity on any banner. Now, you're probably thinking, oh wow, Zeno, that sounds incredible! It's such a preposterous amount of free-to-play currency on the regular. No wonder the community loved this game so much, despite it being gacha-based, and yeah, you'd be correct. But sadly, corporate adult Zeno here, there was also little reason to ever spend money and support the game financially to summon for new weapons on banners. Yes, you absolutely could, and yes, there was 100% people who had bad luck with the ticket system and the RNG of the gems that they used in banners. I won't pretend to downplay that. There is many people in my own Discord community that had got the gacha shaft and were constantly on the downtrodden trying to build back up for favorite units, and sometimes there was a stretch of releases of characters from their own favorite Final Fantasy series they'd have to pick and choose. It definitely happened, but that is not exclusive to DFFOO. In fact, for over 10 years of gacha experience myself, that is completely the norm. I don't like it, I wish this was not the case. Nobody wants their fun being dictated by RNG mechanics, but it's not DFFOO's fault either. This was just the game's design in order to make money to earn its living. I think to overlook how free-to-play friendly this game was, if you had some form of restraint in saving for only, say, favorite units and only summoning when you could hard pity something, there was a lot to love about this gacha system, at least compared to most other games on the market, again, for better or worse. That's not even to touch on the fact that the system itself fed back into the beast. When you maxed out a weapon, you could sell it for materials, which would make it easier to summon the next weapons, cutting down costs of needing duplicates and freeing up more free-to-play currency. It was simple, but it was ingenious, and more games should adopt this system. I did not see it enough. And it also incentivized long-term play. Obviously, as the game aged further, more weapons were introduced that cost sometimes more than a month's worth of free-to-play currency that you could obtain, to incentivize spending as the game started to die down sales-wise and the player-wise when it gets this old, as to be expected. And because a lot of the players in the community had been super loyal and playing for years, and we used resources at our disposal, like say, seeing 6 months ahead in the JP version of the game, so we knew every single banner and when it would arrive, we could still get whatever we wanted outside exclusive global first content and banners for like, say, anniversaries. In the end though, I did spend money on the game myself, but it was only for like minor monthly VIP style passes, occasionally some sales bundles with like limited time materials, but mostly it was costumes, which was actually a big part of the game for me personally. Mostly due to the fact that it was so free to play friendly and I myself had very good RNG luck, there was never a possible reason to spend money to exclusively pull something. Also, I will circle back to costumes after we finish up the gacha and weapon system as well. So across the years, as the game grew even further, in typical gacha fashion, new styles of weapons kept being introduced. Weapons would give you access to new skills, new moves, new mechanics, and along with the fact that characters themselves had whole entire kits getting buffed on a semi-regular basis, sometimes it only took one weapon release to change how a character worked completely in battle, giving them access to things they didn't have before, more hits in their attacks, more HP damage, more buffs, debuffs, more party-wide support, even changing how they play completely, like in Final Fantasy X Auron's sake, you name it. I remember when things started to drastically heat up weapon-wise, it was probably the burst weapons. Prior to this, most of the weapons, generally speaking, just added a new skill or a move. It was more powerful and upgraded the overall character's kit. Burst weapons were the first big, oh my god, what is this moment in DFFOO? These weapons gave a whole new level of power creep and excitement to the game, when a character would essentially enter like a solo domain where they could use every single ability at their disposal in their kit in succession with nearly no penalties, backed up with their own super unique OST music from their respective game, and then finish off with like a giant burst move, a super unique fancy animation attack, usually one of their most popular limit break style moves. Once these got introduced, the game changed heavily, but I still think changed fairly. Instead of purely building a cohesive party composition to tackle bosses and events, or hit certain mechanics in fights, like say for example, do fire damage, debuff the enemy, you had this added layer of buffing up a single unit with every added increase that you could muster, so their burst damage window was as devastating as it possibly could be, in which you also had the choice to activate at any time from turn 1 to the battle's end. The game became slowly more complicated with the increase in difficulty, mandatory mechanics that had you to abide by in fights, resulting in the bosses auto-wiping your party otherwise. The burst weapons slowly needed, and the damage phases that accompanied them needed strategizing as well. Even further down the line towards the tail end, we got yet another new banner style weapon called the FR weapons. This is where I think DFFOO started on a fairly linear trajectory of its complete downfall with no way to recover. By this stage of the game's lifespan, there was always other reasons as to why players left, moved on, got bored, but I truly think FR era was the nail in that coffin. So let's unpack the FR era a bit, because I feel it's important to discuss in DFFOO's history. It wasn't just the issue that these new FR weapons were expensive to pity on a banner, which they were, or had lower rates than the old weapons. Side note, unless I'm mistaken, it was at this time that the older rarity weapons could actually be obtained at higher rates and lower pity amounts on said banners, as the pool for unique weapons started to get higher and the investment per character grew ever more. But the issue came that the FR weapons weren't just a new mechanic added to a character's already saturated kit, they were mandatory to engage in the new difficulty spike of events and battles. The FR gauge was yet another change to the endgame content, which is completely fine in and of itself. However, as mentioned, to even engage with this on the player side, you were forced to use FR weapons and pull. This wasn't a case of this new tier of summonable gacha weapons made your characters or teams stronger, and yes, in layman's terms, they did, but it was the fact that without a single FR weapon in your party of 3 combatants, you cannot interact with this gauge. Now, obviously, players are bound to pick up many FR weapons over the course of play, but I don't think that's the point, so please hear me out. The gauge itself, in simplest terms, was like a stagger gauge from Final Fantasy XIII. Using skills and moves in battle raised that gauge, and when it hit 100%, you then had a limited amount of actions to raise the damage percent higher and inflict monstrous damage on the enemy. In doing so, you would often negate the effects of the boss FR gauge, which would also build up over time like yours, resulting in devastating negative effects to your party, or sometimes just full party wipes under the right circumstances. It was in your absolute imperative that you boosted up that FR gauge, hopefully before the bosses, and deal as much damage as you could in the limited amount of actions that you had. The idea of the FR gauge was fine, and it was not my favorite, and ultimately it led me to quit long before end of service, but new ways to play is usually better, always a positive experience, so the game doesn't get too monotonous. When the FR era weapons dropped and the new endgame content came with it to justify the large number increase of damage your characters can now dish out, the first few fights were possible to actually beat without these new weapons. I in fact did this myself on my account, as did many others, to prove that you didn't need these new expensive gacha weapons just yet. However, it quickly turned into a slog, as the damage in the FR mode was multiplicative. If you were able to raise the gauge to 700%, you were literally doing 700% more damage. There was nothing that you could do to compare to this from prior years of new weapons and tuning passes and difficulty spikes. The community quickly realized how mandatory getting at least some of these weapons were. The difference became simple. Summon a very expensive new gacha weapon at a higher pity rate than previous weapons, except for bursts, or you simply cannot do the final difficulty of all events going forward. Obviously, like in most of this video, I am speaking broad terms. There is exceptions to every rule, but this was the new quota that was laid down by the devs. The special thing about burst weapons I had previously talked about was that you had a chance to get that weapon across several banners as the premier burst weapon. And yes, they did function differently to FR weapons, but that's not the point. You could pick and choose banners for characters that you maybe contained favorites or things that you'd previously missed, or just try your luck across several at once. FR weapons were banner to banner weapons, so every 5 to 10 days there was a new one for a character, and they were the most expensive weapon. It led players to not being able to grab any FR they actually wanted for any unit they actually wanted to play, despite how free to play friendly the game was. This wasn't even the largest issue that the FR era introduced. Having the foresight from the JP version of the game, we could tell which FR weapons were better than most, which were easier to use and slot into team compositions, and which to avoid. If you were deep into the community aspect anyway, research-wise, a few FR weapons came out fairly quickly, which completely broke the balance of the game and utterly invalidated the ones people had just spent large amounts of gems on when the game was already starting to crack from the introductions of this era. There were characters that had moves that could now charge the gauge by leaps and bounds faster than the rest of the cast, let alone effects in the FR itself that when triggered in battle, they were just such a massive difference that it wasn't a fair playing field for the rest of the cast. I ended up quitting playing myself probably around 6+ months ago, if not more, before end of service, and I wasn't the only one. The game became so terribly unbalanced so quickly, and it became so one-sided in the player experience that, more often than not, you could boost this gauge to max, initiate the FR time, boost your damage percentage, and 1 or 2 shot kill many events and bosses for weeks in burst modes, sometimes months on end, with the right team comps and super powerful DPS units, never having to engage with the game, its mechanics, the bosses, and it just became super boring. Gone were the times of the Lafenia era, where bosses had purple orbs above their heads, and it was counted down to 0, you automatically died. So you had to bring certain styles of characters, outside call abilities, or summons to strategize your way to victory. You could very well not beat certain stages if you were sometimes not building out a more full roster of diverse units and damage dealers, tanks, supports, healers, and anything in between. Now you had a system where the latest RNG gacha summons were intrinsically tied to the latest endgame content. This resulted in just a complete character imbalance, difficulty unbalance, and overall just a very poor game state. And as a result, the community's morale plummeted more than it ever had before. Now, this of course is just my humble opinion, right? There is tons of people that loved this new era of events and difficulty and carried on accepting a new style of play, and hey look, kudos to them. There's no shame in that, and if you had fun and you found value in that era, that is brilliant stuff. But in fact, I'll play further devil's advocate. You didn't have to play the latest difficulty to get nearly all the in-game rewards either. It's all player choice, but this game was kept alive by its bright and cheerful community of die-hard RPG and Final Fantasy enthusiasts that enjoyed this gameplay, which not many were anymore. I enjoyed the FR era somewhat for a time, because it was different, but in the end, using the same like 10 people out of a nearly 200 upwards cast member game, even when some of those units that I was using were the favorite characters in my life, like a Cloud or a Tifa or an Aerith, it wasn't fun and it got stale. I also just didn't need to summon as often, as overpowered FR weapons and kits just blew everything else out of the water. DFFOO had lost its magic, its special touch of being a mega crossover game. Tying a new gameplay mechanic to the Gacha system is a surefire way to get people to move on and play other games in their free time, which is what a lot of people ended up doing. Especially this late into a live service title's lifespan, where the devs needed to find ways to bring people in or at least keep the ones loyal, content, and happy. It just didn't work. So again, this is where I personally think the game started to go down a path of absolutely no restoration because of this endgame. The only way to change the gameplay again in any new and meaningful way would be to go through nearly all 200 units and give them all the FR weapons first before you move on to the next tier. But by that stage, and with how slow moving the banners were at the beginning, we're talking upwards of 2+ years into an era that most people didn't like. Sales were dropping heavily, community members were leaving, YouTubers and streamers were winding down in their content creation, podcasts and live shows were becoming bi-weekly basis or monthly instead. There wasn't a way for the devs to turn this around, and the writing was on the wall. They had backed themselves into a corner, and the corner was now approaching 5 to 6 years old, and to ask the community to survive for another 1 to 2 years while making enough money for the higher ups to not close down this dream game, it just wasn't possible anymore. So that's where I think that DFFOO mishandled its legacy, and ultimately, being a super old gacha game in this day and age, there wasn't a feasible way to get people to spend lots of money and to continue to support this game anymore. And ultimately I left, because I had seen this many times before and it was only a matter of time before the game was announced for the end, and so I chose to leave on my own accord, and mostly happily, before it ever got to that depressing stage and end of service inevitably came to pass. A hard pivot now to a different topic. Back to costumes, actually. I mentioned that before I ranted about the Gacha system and the FR era of difficulty. I will say this was exclusively tied to those that paid for it, sadly, but I do think this is one of the game's biggest money makers, and most people were pretty happy to spend for these outfits because of how fantastic the game was overall. I think over the course of 3 to 4 years, I bought roughly 15+ costumes, and they were not cheap at all. But as mentioned, there weren't many ways to financially support the game when it was so free-to-play friendly, and especially when I had better luck than most when it came to my personal summons. So I had costumes, like Cloud's Advent Children outfit, Tifa's, Yuffie's. I had Aerith's red dress, I had Zack's soldier, you had Ishtola's Heavensward outfit, which I actually have, an $800 version of that statue outfit. You had alt costumes for the Type 0 characters like Rem and Ace. You had Lightning's outfits from Lightning Returns, or her goddess outfit from the second game. And just many, many more. The game had an incredible amount of costumes for most of the entire cast, and it was just a lot of fun seeing people in co-op wearing different ones. This goes for weapons too, although all you need to do for weapon skins was just have like a single copy of said weapon at some stage. So seeing Cloud run around in Advent Children outfits using like random swords or an axe was like super fun. It gave your favorite characters more of a unique identity and showed off more of your personality a bit more as well. And while the game focused on weapons to summon and costumes to buy, there was only ever one version of said character. Other gacha games have a swimsuit version, a Christmas version, a White Day or Valentine's version, and those characters typically would be completely new variations. DFFOO handled this really admirably. Instead of trying to sell you Bikini Tifa as a separate Tifa character, I would have bought it anyway, you cowards. You could just buy a costume skin, which affected nothing gameplay-wise, just a cosmetic, so bravo for that. We've now touched on community, gacha, difficulty, cosmetics, let's activate combat mode. All those things are nice, but like, how does the game play? Well, as mentioned numerous times now, the game is a turn-based RPG. You have a party of 3, you take turns where you can see the turn order of who is next in line, and your goal 99% of the time, if not 100%, is to kill the enemy before they kill you. Battles play out in typical turn-based fashion, but of course with a game coming off a 6 to 7 year old lifespan, it gets far more complicated and convoluted than that. You had buffs to the parties, self-buffs and party buffs, things like attack up, HP damage up, defensive buffs, elemental buffs, type advantage buffs like melee damage, magic damage. This logic also applied to debuffs, single target, AoE. There were aura buffs, buffs that simply just existed as part of an effect that cannot be dispelled or removed. You had attacks that do brave damage, which can break the enemy while building up your maximum damage. Think of it like breaking down a shield type mechanic, although shields and barriers existed too. HP damage attacks, although in the later years of the game every single skill did HP damage and the screen is just filled with zillions of numbers and it's hard to tell what's going on. But I digress. You have characters that focus on types of damages that I just mentioned, characters that did range damage only, characters that have kits that can also do magic and melee mixed together, magic units that specialize in elemental damages like thunder and water like Garnet, ones that solo focus on wind like Fujim, dark and fire like Vivi. You had characters that had debuffs to sap the enemy's HP or brave like Elfino or Ida, give them elemental resist downs or ranged resist downs like Fran, debuffs that would lower overall stats like Pain, that in the earlier lifespan of DFFOO, before balance was ruined and creativity was thrown out the door, meant you could overstack certain statistics like, say, max brave down or attack down debuffs, and just utterly neuter the enemy so they can never deal enough damage to kill you. You have units that we'd call off-turn damage dealers. These people, like the Dragoon Kane or the Turk Cisne, would rain down DPS on every action or turn, enemies and parties alike, which allowed for more damage in those burst phases that I mentioned previously in the video. You had characters that focused exclusively on niches, like launching enemies, a mechanic that allowed you to juggle the enemies in the air, where your full party of 3, if lined up correctly in the turn order, got an extra attack in, like Sid Reigns from Final Fantasy XIII, or Kais. You had units that could delete the enemy's turns completely from the action order, like Amidadelian. You had units that would sustain the party as various different types of tanks, dodging in front of characters like Galuf, tanking hits with no damage like Gladio and counterattacking, shielders like Warrior of Light. You had units that were jack of all trades, like Cloud, my favorite. He had cross slash for paralysis to stop the enemies from moving, finishing touch to launch and juggle bosses in the air, AoE turn manipulation with his Blade Beam, delaying the turn order, and an AA ability that deals guaranteed critical damage just in case you couldn't get through a certain mechanic. You had supports that did massive heals, regen heals, heals on damage, debuff resistance. There was call abilities that you can bring in on any member of the near 200 full cast, with a watered down version of 2 of their skills, some which were game-breakingly important to allow teams to survive, pass mechanics, threshold, do more damage, you name it. I could literally ramble on, and this isn't including any of the enemy variety and all the resistances that they might have or the mechanics they might have, which at the game's final stage probably labeled in the hundreds. There's just so much that I could mention, and entire things I haven't even touched on. The point is, there was simply no other turn-based RPG game, to my knowledge, mind you, in over 25 years of RPG gaming experience, in existence that has ever had this considerable depth to its battle system, with this many characters all specializing in nearly completely different paths for combat, that somehow worked and combined together. And as a final result, it was a paragon, an utter triumph in turn-based RPG gameplay. Now, of course, there's 1,001 games that might actually be more fun to play, though, as every person's fun is subjective, including my own. Just because a battle system is exhaustingly in-depth, it doesn't always mean it's the greatest achievement ever to mankind, but you would be severely hard-pressed to name a turn-based RPG system that comes even remotely close in comparison for variety and gameplay. I loved DFFOO's combat, truly I did. Like, at times, yeah, it got a little boring in the final stages of its lifespan because it became very repetitive and dumbed down, All those elements and debuffs and buffs, gimmicks and niches that units focused on that I mentioned above, it became a ghost of the past. You could run nearly any DPS, any support, and just crush content with very little regard to mechanics anymore. And the FR era that I ranted earlier above crushed this unique battle system even further into dust. And anybody that hadn't been playing for years prior wouldn't have even known what it was like to truly strategize a full team comp for each and every unique situation. And that's just a damn shame. Let's talk events briefly and the content the game offered on a weekly and monthly basis that you could form teams to fight and play through. DFFOO had a main story, which was fairly trivial in the grand scheme of things. You either liked it or you didn't and just skipped the cutscenes, which many people did. I sometimes skipped cutscenes depending on which cast members the story was focusing on at the time. If you're not familiar with Dissidia as a franchise, the gods Materia and Chaos have summoned all the members of Final Fantasy games to a world for one reason or another. And in this world, all the heroes fight the villains and vice versa. Some villains come over to the good side, some don't. Most people have lost their memories. You journey around the world, beating up bad guys, trying to save the place. Basically, it's a fan fiction style story created just to see your favorites. Easiest way to describe it. You had a starting party of Rem from Type 0, Vivi from Final Fantasy 9, Warrior Light from Final Fantasy 1, and Saz from Final Fantasy 13, I think. And you slowly meet more and more people. You travel through many different biomes and locations on an overworld map in the style of tiles that you can select. You beat the big bad bosses like Kefka and Kuja and Sephiroth and Ultimecia. You name it, they're all there. And all kinds of creatures and monsters and robots and insects and just dragons and anything else Final Fantasy related you can possibly think of, including summons actually, it was there. Most of the main story was fairly hit and miss, but some chapters were pretty damn good. Some of the main story chapters focused on actually retelling parts of the main games those characters were focused on, like in Final Fantasy 13 Trilogy's case. It retreaded a lot of the same ground there. There was also just new original content that felt like a fever dream. Like this carried over into the Lost Chapters and the Intertwined Will events that the game had. Small scale story events, which usually introduce new characters, or just allows you to see a group of random members of various Final Fantasy games come together for little side quests and conversations, meetups, and more. For example, you had times like Tidus traveling with Jecht, finally getting to see his dad, asking questions about everything, bonding with him, seeing Jecht have this like deep sorrow about his actions as a father and bringing Tidus to Spira to save the world. Things obviously Tidus could not do in Final Fantasy X. All while Jecht knows that he's either dead from the game or has to die in the future. You had moments from FF10 again, like Yuna getting to meet Braska, her father as an adult, and just have conversations. And that to me is wild as a mega Final Fantasy X fan. You had Cloud and Zack from Final Fantasy VII interacting, Zack and Aerith reuniting, Kadaj from Advent Children in the Final Fantasy cast before he turns fully evil from just wild stuff. You had Bart from Final Fantasy V meeting and fighting alongside his father, Dorgan. You had Cecil meeting his future son, Seodor, from the After Years game before he's even born yet and fighting alongside him. You had Young and his daughter Ursula and teaching her martial arts. You had Noctis from Final Fantasy 15 and Youl from Final Fantasy 13. Like, what? The Final Fantasy 14 cast, Ishtola and Elfino, Elisei, Thancred. You had Papalymo getting proper closure from his death in the game with Lise. The twins, Lan and Rain from the world of Final Fantasy with Enna Crow. It really was, unquestionably, fan fiction in the flesh, like in a playable form. For long-term legacy Final Fantasy gamers who had played a lot of Final Fantasy games to date, this was pretty surreal. Like, if you took the time to sit down and cherish these sweet little moments of meaningless story between the characters and all kinds of different Final Fantasy worlds and timelines, you'd find something truly special here that I think when people who have played this game look back in the years to come, this will be one of the main things they focus on fondly. As for endgame content, DFFOO had its fair share. It had a tower climb thing called Dimension's End, where you could pick a team of 3 units and you could not use them again for like the entire event, meaning you were forced to summon more often, building a larger assortment of teams, tackling numerous mechanics that were often completely different than the prior stages. This became even funner down the line as well, because when a character got a new weapon and an updated tuning pass, you'd try and go back and free them from the old stages to use them in the newer stages, essentially juggling your roster on a constant basis. There were more styles of this content too, where you could only choose 6 characters to tackle 3 stages in total, where the left and right stages, once beaten, combined into a top stage, where you could then only pick 3 of those 6 units for the final fight. Again, it was emphasizing an abundance of quality options in your roster, never keeping things stale. They had 6-man events, literally taking 6 units at once to fight like an ultra hard boss or 2, where you could swap units in and out of the party at will from the 6 chosen, making team building all of a sudden mega important on a far larger scale. Sadly, this particular piece of endgame content was introduced a little later into the life cycle of DFFOO, and as such, when you can pair 6 of the best or most broken units in the game in one team, it could easily result in like total chaos destruction and rinsing the bosses. Not always, but more often than not. The game had a fair balance of endgame content, including lots of lockout content as well, using units only once per event, lots of tower modes. There was an Abyss style event where you could only bring red crystal units that had swords, blue crystal units that could only use magic. Those were really fun mostly too. DFFOO had co-op, very basic co-op mind you, but co-op nonetheless. And as all live service games go, you can imagine already that co-op was indeed hit and miss. It was fun when I used to stream on my old channels and play with viewers or friends in my Discord, but playing with randoms sometimes was such an annoyance and a headache that I would start a co-op and then just play it solo instead, as DFFOO players unfortunately had a tendency to not read very well and would get everyone killed or just disconnect and not click the right damn shiny buttons. But for the most part overall, the game's content was very solid. Like, most people who are hardcore could easily pass all of the endgame content on the fly with fairly minor planning and pulling regularly. It still had a fair chunk of variation, and again, I want to say bravo. Was it perfect? No, but considering the love for the game by the dev team, when I look back now, it was more than enough, and they did the game's overwhelming roster of units a fair justice with reasons to use them more often than not. There is still tons of things that I haven't even touched on. There was a small friend system, there was stickers you could use in co-op, summons like Ifrit, Shiva, Pandemonium, Alexander, Leviathan, Odin that you could fight, farm up materials and levels to use them in battle. There was customization in terms of unique spheres that you can attach to characters for minor stat buffs, passives that you could farm, that you could equip, skill trees, armors to upgrade to help break the damage cap of your skills and numbers, that give buffs as well. There was ultimate weapons that you could craft that anybody could equip for that weapon type. And there was another whole upgrade system that I never even interact with it after I quit the game myself. This game had it all from a turn-based RPG perspective, and even though, through its ups and downs, I will always remember fondly the time spent in this game's universe with its cast, and the content offering, and the love the devs poured into this. Guys, before I leave you with one last special paragraph, which will be after I say goodbye in a few seconds, so please hang around for that, I hope you enjoyed today's retrospective style history lesson on Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia. This game meant a lot to me over the years. It's where I met a vast majority of my current online friends in Discord and other creators across the world. Like mentioned above, there is many things I didn't even remark on regarding this game, but I think most people will be okay with this, considering how long this video will end up being and how much I did manage to cover in the end. Remember, if you liked the video, let me know down below. Please, I urge you to comment your favorite memories from DFFOO, your summons, the errors of difficulty, certain fights, parts of the community, positive, negative. I respond to all comments. I love talking with people. Remember to join the Discord. Find me on Twitter and other social medias. And with that all being said, I'll leave it there. I hope you guys having a fan-freaking-tastic rest of the day. And as always, my name is Zeno. This was Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia. And you guys take care now. As the echoes of battles past fade into memory, and the stars align for one final time, I bid farewell to the realm of Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia. In this epic saga, heroes and villains from across the Final Fantasy universe united to face common foes, weaving a tapestry of friendship, courage, and sacrifice. To the valiant warriors whose bravery knew no bounds, thank you for your unwavering dedication in the fight against chaos. From the depths of despair to the pinnacle of triumph, you've stood together as beacons of hope, inspiring us all to strive for greatness in our real lives. To the cherished community, whose passion ignited the flames of friendship throughout, thank you for embarking on this unforgettable journey. The support, feedback, and enthusiasm I have witnessed as a fellow member has been the cornerstone of this game's success, shaping the very essence of everyone's adventure and lives. As we close this chapter and embark on new horizons, let us carry the memories of our time together as treasures in our hearts. Though our paths may diverge, the bonds we've forged will endure, connecting us across time and space. Farewell, brave warriors of light and darkness. May your spirits soar on wings of legend, and may the echoes of your valor resound throughout eternity. Until we meet again, may your adventures be ever glorious. Thank you, Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, for your incredible odyssey, and you will never be forgotten.